Alright, today we're going to talk about what happened after the revolutions where the American countries gained independence and, the outcomes of those revolutions. So first up was the United States of America, one after the American Revolution, the first independence movement in the American colonies. But even after independence, the U.S. constantly had to defend its sovereignty and its independence. And there are two specific documents that sort of show that. One is the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, and it basically stated European aggression would not be tolerated anywhere in the Americas. That includes the United States, but that also includes other Latin American countries too. And then also the Roosevelt Corollary states that the U.S. would support any country in the Americas against Europe. So not only could the Europeans not come over and bully or boss around the United States, but they also couldn't do that to other Latin American countries either. And one of the reasons for this is the U.S. was constantly expanding, and they kind of had a lot of influence over Latin America, but the U.S. was growing rapidly. It was expanding from the 13 colonies that existed on the eastern coast of North America to basically across the North America. And even further past that. The first big acquisition of land was the Louisiana Purchase, which is all this territory right in here. And the Louisiana Purchase was bought from France, and it was highly contested because they weren't sure that the federal government was actually legally allowed to do this yet. But they bought the land. They continued expanding even further. The Southwest was taken from Spain and from Mexico after Mexico gained independence. And a couple pieces were bought from France and Britain up in the north, and then from Spain in the south. Alaska was bought from Russia, which is here, but really on the map it would be up north. And then parts of the Caribbean and the Philippines, which we'll come back to in just a second. After the United States expanded, they were industrializing very quickly. They sort of followed the European designs with industrialization. Here you can kind of see the railroads that developed throughout the Americas. And they even started extending all the way across the United States. Factories, railroads, and a lot of the new technologies were actually developed in the United States, like the light bulb, the assembly line, and the automobiles. A lot of these like early technologies in industrialization actually occurred in the United States. So industrialization, even though it started in Europe, was very big in the United States, and this is one of the ways that the U.S. got powerful so quickly was with industrialization. The U.S. also, as it becomes industrialized and gets more powerful, we're going to start to exert influence over other countries, especially in Latin America. Here you can kind of see Latin American territories that the U.S. sort of controlled, and also even out here in the Pacific Ocean as well. The Philippines we conquered, and the Caribbean. But we wanted to basically be able to do what the Europeans had done. We wanted to sort of boss them around and use their resources to our own advantage. And one of the things that we did, especially in Panama, was we built the Panama Canal, which it goes through a very thin part of Panama. It's basically a man-made river that's dug through Central America, so that no longer boats will no longer have to sail all the way around South America, but then they can have a lot shorter distance. This helps us move our goods from east to west coast a lot faster. Helped us industrialize, helped us in our economy with trading, all that kind of stuff. But we had to sort of exert our influence over Latin American countries, especially Panama, to do that. The U.S. also had a pretty significant event. The Civil War was fought, which almost led to the end of the United States as a whole. But basically, the United States was fought between the northern countries and the southern countries. The northern countries were much more industrialized, and the southern countries were largely based on agricultural production, using slavery. And so eventually the Enlightenment sort of spreads. There's kind of this movement against slavery. They wanted to abolish slavery. And so the North, as the United States is spreading out and new states are being formed, there's a huge issue of whether these states in the West will become free states where there's no slavery, or slave states. And the U.S. government started to push for, the federal government started to push for free states, and to kind of end slavery altogether. And so the southern states sort of got together, whose economy depended on slavery, and they started to fight against the North. But that being said, it wasn't all about slavery, the Civil War. It was also in large part about states' rights versus federal rights. Did the federal government actually have the legal constitutional right to tell the states whether they could have slaves or not? Eventually, the North won because it was much more industrialized and well supplied than the South. Also in the United States, there were a lot of enclave communities. An enclave community excuse me, is basically a minority group that's not respected. So they kind of stay to themselves. They don't want to interact with the larger populations. One big enclave community was the Native Americans, who had lost most of their land and had been forced onto reservations. One real famous event was the Ghost Dance, where several Native American tribes gathered together and they tried to basically perform this spiritual dance to call spirits to their aid so that they could be freed from the white people that had taken their land. And basically what was going to happen was a new earth was going to fall down and cover everybody up, but the spirits would help the Native Americans rise up above that dirt that's covering the world. You also have African sharecroppers who have won their freedom. They're no longer slaves, but they're still not doing very well because of debt. They would have to pay for the land that they grew crops on, and so they were sort of stuck in a cycle of poverty, and were definitely disrespected and kind of stuck in there. Even though they were free, they were not. They did not gain the rights that they would have wanted. You also have the Chinese Exclusion Acts. Many Chinese came over from China to find jobs in the United States. There's a lot of opportunity, especially doing hard manual labor like digging mines in California. And so a lot of Chinese came over, but they took American jobs, and so they were often not liked by the whites in America. And so much so that there was even something called the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which prevented more Chinese from coming over to the United States. In France, after the revolution in France, the Committee of Public Safety, which was put in charge to kind of to protect people's rights and to maintain order, eventually the French Revolution was so much a failure that they set up a 5-man government called a Directory, very similar to what Rome did with the Triumvirate. But they set up a 5-person government in this Directory, and out of that 5-person government, one person rose to power named Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon, as you can see here in this picture, he was a pretty small person, and it's kind of this idea where the Napoleon complex comes from. He was a very strong-willed, very aggressive man. But he was also an enlightened despot. He respected people's rights, and he even created the Napoleonic Codes, which called for equality of males, religious toleration, and to create public education institutions so that all people could have equal opportunity. But even though he was an enlightened despot, he was very aggressive, especially in his military endeavors. Napoleon really wanted to conquer all of Europe. And here you can see France in this map. And all the territory in blue is stuff that Napoleon conquered. And so he conquered most of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and a lot of territory, and he was going even further and further. He finally was defeated when he tried to attack Moscow, and he tried to do it in the middle of winter, and all the Russians fled in the middle of winter and then burned Moscow to the ground so that Napoleon's troops didn't have anywhere to be in the winter. So he had to make this long march back home in the winter, where they finally overthrew him. Then they set up the Congress of Vienna, where European leaders meet to decide what to do with France. And they basically decide that they are going to give power back to a king, set up a monarchy, give it back to the Bourbon dynasty. And eventually France would develop into a constitutional monarch, kind of like British. Yeah. In Latin America, we talked about several revolutions. The first one in Haiti, the slave revolt, which was led by Overture. But he dies, and after he dies, a guy named Pestilence comes in and takes over, and he declares himself emperor for life. Here's Pestilence. And as he declares himself emperor for life, he sort of sets up a long line of very unsuccessful leadership, which is going to make Haiti a very bad place to live. And not to mention that their economy was destroyed in the slave revolt. Also in Gran Colombia, you have constant fighting in Gran Colombia, which leads to the breakup into several Latin American countries. So all these countries right in here sort of were created as Creoles couldn't decide how to rule the country, so they split up into several different countries themselves. In Brazil and in Mexico, the leaders were assassinated. Jose Morelos and Pedro II. Both of them wanted to end slavery in their country, and so the landowners that had made a lot of money off the slaves, they came in and assassinated them so that they could keep their slaves. In both countries, slavery did end, but the lives of the slaves did not get much better for another 100 years. And you could still argue that the effects of that are seen today. There were very rigid class divisions remained. Slavery or forced labor continued in a lot of the countries. There was never really industrialization, so that kept them behind. And they were still dependent on Europeans and the U.S. for exports. Since they didn't industrialize, they didn't really have good ships. They didn't have any merchant activity going on, so they still relied on these people to control trade for them. And so that is what happened after the revolutions.